News.
Bruce Klingner spent 20 years in the intelligence community with a focus on the Korean Peninsula, now serves as Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. And Mr. Klingner put this week's ballistic missile launch by North Korea into perspective. How big of a leap forward is this for North Korea?
It's a very troublesome development, very troubling in that although it's long been predicted, and indeed North Korea said earlier this year they would do an ICBM test by the end of this year, it's still a significant step forward. In the past, they have had what we think it would be an ICBM from a fixed launch site, what they call the unha, and that has a range that could hit all of the continental U.S., but that's sort of easily identified and easily targeted if necessary. This is from a mobile vehicle that makes it much harder to identify and, if necessary, track and attack during a conflict. So the missile was flown at a sort of unusually high trajectory so that it wouldn't fly over Japan, and also to allow it to test a reentry vehicle, which would protect a warhead during an actual flight. But had it been flown to a normal trajectory, it could have hit perhaps 600 or 6,700 kilometers, which is all the way to Alaska, and that's very likely not the maximum range.
You wrote in the May-June issue of Foreign Affairs, the world is facing its greatest nuclear emergency since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's past time for the United States to act decisively. In the wake of this week's test, what does that now mean?
Well, there are some who advocate a preventative military strike in the sense of preventing North Korea from completing development of its ICBM. I actually disagree with that. I think it's unnecessarily provocative. Even an interception of the missile in midair or taking it on a launch stand or a more extensive bombing campaign really escalates the potential for an all-out war on the Korean Peninsula. When I was in the government, we did war games or tabletop exercises. The Allies always won, but it was the casualties were hundreds of thousands, and that was before we estimated they had nuclear weapons. So what we need to do is increase the pressure on North Korea. There's a pretty widespread misperception that sanctions are maxed out, that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, and that's simply not correct.
People have been asking this week, can we negotiate with Pyongyang? You're a person who's tried to do that.
Well, I met last month with North Korean officials in Europe, and they made emphatically clear, as they have publicly, that denuclearization is totally off the table. There is nothing the U.S. or South Korea can offer which would induce them to abandon their nuclear arsenal. As they said, accept us as a nuclear state, then we're ready to either talk about a peace treaty or fight.
What was the context that you had this meeting in?
It was a conference of U.S., South Korean, Chinese, Japanese, usually former officials, a meeting with current North Korean officials. So it's part of a series of Track 1.5 meetings, as they're called, and the message is usually the same, is that they will not negotiate away their nuclear arsenal.
So this is an opening we could use for further negotiations? You don't see this as
no, and
constructive?
My colleagues and I, we tried different options. What about this? What about that? And the North Koreans became irritated and just said, stop it. Just accept us as a nuclear state. And I even said near the end, I said, well, other Americans, when they engage in these meetings, come back with signals or signs of flexibility. I'm not detecting any of that. And they said, you're right, there is no flexibility.
We're talking with Bruce Klingner of the Heritage Foundation. We're talking about North Korea, U.S. options in North Korea in the wake of that launch this week. Want to get your questions and thoughts this morning. You can call in Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, Independents 202-748-8002. We're going to be talking with Bruce Klingner until the end of our program today, until about 10 o'clock. I want to ask you about President Trump's tweet yesterday and how you read it. He said yesterday, trade between China and North Korea grew almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. Obviously, referring to U.S. efforts to engage China here on the issue of North Korea. What do you take away from that tweet?
Well, it seems President Trump has lost patience with China, as every preceding U.S. president has done. Everyone has the idea that if only we can get China on board to fulfill required UN sanctions, because it has such a large trade balance with North Korea, But China has always promised to do much and always underperformed. So at the Mar-a-Lago summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, Trump felt he had received Chinese promises to do more, and then now I think he realizes that once again China's disappointing us.
What's the incentive for China to help the United States here?
Well, one is they are required to do these sanctions under the UN. So they are turning a blind eye to proliferation, which is occurring on their soil. They're turning a blind eye to Chinese entities which are engaging with North Korea on its prohibited nuclear and missile program. So it's not completing or not implementing, or in essence violating itself, the UN sanctions, or at least the entities in China are.
And what's the incentive for China to see these tensions between the United States and the Korean Peninsula?
Well, China doesn't like what North Korea is doing. They don't like a North Korean nuclear program, but they are unwilling to do any pressure on North Korea because they fear either an explosion in the sense of North Korea lashing out, or an implosion in the sense of regime instability or even regime collapse.
Bruce Klingner, taking your calls this morning. Michael is up first in Lebanon, New Jersey. Independent. Michael, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Sir, there's a famous quote, and it goes like this. It is a tribute to the American people that the leaders and representatives perceived it necessary to lie to wage war, but it is not a tribute to the public that they could be so easily fooled. And that was Mr. Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers. And, sir, when Nikki Haley spoke up and made the outrageous statement to the world that we have the military ability to do whatever we want, legal or not, the North Korean situation, you have no options. The only option you have is to provoke a major war illegally, because they have the right to defend their country with whatever military arms they can develop, just like we did. And to show the lies here, if your narrative is that to protect the United States from a nuclear attack, and that's why you're going to go to war, well, then why aren't you at war with Russia and China right now, who have the ability to take us out in 5 minutes?
Bruce Klingner, give you a chance to respond.
Well, there's a difference between the Russia and Chinese nuclear and missile programs and those of North Korea, because under numerous UN Security Council resolutions, North Korea is prohibited from having nuclear and missile programs. The international community has decided that. It's not simply the United States. It's the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. So not only is North Korea prohibited from doing nuclear tests or long-range missile or even any missile tests using ballistic missile technology, but they are compelled by the UN to abandon both their nuclear and their missile programs in a complete, verifiable, irreversible manner. So it is not the U.S. only that's trying to denuclearize them. It is the UN Security Council. And indeed, North Korea promised in 4 international agreements never to build nuclear weapons, either uranium or plutonium-based. They violated each one of those. They then signed 4 subsequent agreements to give up the weapons that they promised never to build in the first place.
What was the point of making those promises back then that they clearly weren't going to keep?
I think for them it was maintain strategic ambiguity so that they could continue a plutonium-based and a uranium-based nuclear weapons programs while they promised that they were not building them. So they were sort of sneaking the camel's nose under the tent, and then now we've got the whole camel in the tent.